Well, good evening. So first of all, I want to thank Steve for filling in for me last week. Appreciate that on a relatively short notice, but I did listen to the class, and he did a passable job, so no, it was very good. I was a little disappointed because that was one of my favorite chapters of Daniel. There's a lot of, whenever I do a class, that book usually becomes my favorite book at that time, and then until I do my next one, and then that becomes my new favorite. And then there are certain chapters within these books that just stand out a little more, or speak to me at the whatever point of time when I'm studying them, just a little bit more than others. And that's one, I like the idea of seeing the relationship between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, first of all. How when Daniel realized the bad news of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he didn't want to say it. He didn't want to speak those words to him. And so, and I don't think it was just because he was afraid for his life. And then Nebuchadnezzar's response, the way that he tried to put Daniel at ease and say, don't worry, I'm not going to take it out on you. Just go ahead and tell me what I need to know. And that is an important step for all of us when we're studying and reading the Bible, is being ready and willing to hear things that we may not want to hear, and to not take it out on the messenger if someone else is sharing that information with us about something we might need to change in our lives. Being able to separate that and know that this isn't a personal attack, that someone is bringing these things to us. When we bring things to each other, we're doing it in love with the hope that it will be something that will turn us away from the wrong path, bring us back into a right relationship with God, and something that will preserve our souls. And I think that is one of the main values of the church, is that we can be working together. And when one of us goes off the rails, another one will say, hey, we got to talk. Let's talk about what's going on, and then bring us back in. And so we see Daniel being that friend and prophet to Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar accepts the warning. He does forget, however, and eventually it catches up with him, and his pride takes hold, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And the prophecy is fulfilled. And so he does have to suffer through a humbling experience. And we talked about how there's a kind of a map of these chapters, and I forgot to put the chapter keys in the slides tonight, but how the first two chapters talked about Daniel's deportation into captivity, and then the second chapter is now I'm drawing a blank. Oh, the first dream. So it was the first chapter, and then the second and fourth go together, and then the second and fifth, sorry. Let me just take a look here. I know I've got it. So the first chapter talks about the suffering or the difficulty Daniel went through in being delivered into captivity, but his faithfulness. And then Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. Chapter 3, the golden image and the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. So you've got first chapter is the enduring suffering, then the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and then this fiery furnace is again a chapter of suffering and endurance in that suffering. And then chapter 4, we see Nebuchadnezzar humbled and then restored. And then chapter 5 is a very similar chapter, and we see Belshazzar humbled and not restored. And so then in chapter 6, we'll come back to a story of faith in adversity. And so when we looked at the beginning of this class, we talked about the themes that we want to be looking for in Daniel. What was one of the themes that we talked about so far? Going to be a big one in this class tonight. Okay, faithfulness in adversity. So just like we saw in those stories that we've talked about so far, where there's captivity, the fiery furnace, the lion's den will be one. Those are examples of faithfulness in adversity that the Jews could use when they went back to Jerusalem and were able to reestablish the temple, and would go through some suffering and would be faced with challenges that might make it seem like this was not going to work out. And over a period of time where they might lose faithfulness, thinking that God's forgotten about us and is going to not fulfill his promises. So they have those stories of faithfulness in adversity so that they could draw from those in those times of difficulty. And of course, they're very valuable to us as well, as we can do the same thing. And then the other theme that we talked about was God rules in the kingdoms of men. And we saw that discussed first of all in the Nebuchadnezzar's first dream, how Daniel was able to prophesy that God gave it to him, that what the nations would do and how they would rise and fall. And the fact that God knew those things ahead of time indicated that God is in control of those things. God rules those kingdoms and will raise up and lower others as he wants to. And so this is another chapter where we're going to see that is the primary theme. So as we look at chapter 5, it starts off, well, let's look at the last verse of chapter 4. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. So Nebuchadnezzar is the king, and he's been humbled, and he's learned his lesson, he's come back, and we don't know how long that lasted, if he was really able to hold on to that lesson and have some sort of faithfulness to God beyond that point, or if it lapsed and he went back into his pride and was caused to suffer more. But the last thing we see is Nebuchadnezzar is king. Now the first verse of chapter 5, King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. So we have a new king and no explanation of what happened. We don't need the explanation here because there is some explanation given in Jeremiah, I believe chapter 52, about the rise and fall of those kings. And when our introductory remarks, we noted that there was King Nebuchadnezzar, and then there was two or three kings between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar that Daniel didn't talk about, but they're very short reigns. And so while Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 30-some years, 37 I believe, the three kings in the interim were only reigned for, I believe, 10 to 20 years. And so it was quite a bit more, quite a bit shorter reigns. And that just indicates that they were less successful. There seemed to be more turmoil, less conquering and building projects. So Nebuchadnezzar still would be the top king of Babylon in their history. But Belshazzar appears to be perhaps the great-grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Could be not through the paternal line. It's kind of hard to tell because there's not, as far as I am aware still, there's not any record of Belshazzar in historical records, but there are some indicators of this time and then some subsequent rulers. But Belshazzar is identified as the king. And again, this is just an artist's imagining of what Babylon might have looked like. Babylon was probably the greatest city at that time in the world. And so with the extent of the empire that they had built and the revenues that were coming in, they had a pretty good situation for themselves. And they probably felt pretty secure, especially with these walls, and we'll talk more about the walls, but some estimates were that the walls were more than 80 feet high and 300 feet deep. And so that's like a whole football field of wall between your city and the potential intruders or invaders. And so they felt they had a pretty secure situation there. And I believe it was Herodotus, historian, said that they would have chariot races on the wall around the city. There's so much space and such a large area up there. But this is kind of I just mentioned that because it's just to build an idea of perhaps the mindset of Belshazzar as he is celebrating this great feast and for 1,000 of his lords. And it says, and he drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple should be brought, and that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So we see there's this party, and several times, I mean, it's identified explicitly this appeared to be just a large drinking party. And so it specifies 3 or 4 times that they were drinking wine, and that was pretty much their whole entertainment for this party, I guess. But as they were doing that, we see... Now, first of all, let's go back and look at the idea that Belshazzar commanded that the implements or items from the temple worship would be brought out and used for this. So what does that tell you about his opinion of those items and the culture that it represents? He has no concern about this. He's showing dominance over this nation that we've conquered, and maybe they were gold and silver, so maybe they were really nice, and so he wanted to make his party as nice as possible, so just to glorify himself. And so he commands that those be brought out. But just when I read that, the first thing I thought of was, if anyone's seen the Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark, you don't mess with God's stuff, basically, is the moral of the story. And I don't think that, I think the relationship had been severed in a way at that time where these things were no longer actively used in service to God, and so they didn't carry the same reverence at that time. But it's just kind of a fine line between showing respect to the items that were used to worship God, and without going overboard and putting special or too much importance on the physical items, and then those becoming idols in effect. Mike, did you have? Right.
And even he showed, for lack of better terms, a certain amount of respect for
wisdom, if nothing else, right?
If nothing else.
Yeah.
Where this guy was just totally,
Yeah, and I think that just showed how, intellectually superior Nebuchadnezzar was to Belshazzar, that he wouldn't take unnecessary risks with the peace of his kingdom. He took those items, he didn't destroy them, he didn't abuse them, but he respected them and put them in a place and protected. And whether it was his intent to protect them or that was God working to use Nebuchadnezzar to protect them, they were protected. So, Steve?
How these vessels were put at Shinar in the house of Nebuchadnezzar's god.
Right.
And so likely this party is taking place in Shinar at the house of Nebuchadnezzar's god. So it's probably, a religious fueled,
Right.
and then, go get me the vessels from the temple. There's just that disrespect and a misuse of sacred relics, is I'm going to take the sacred things and use it for myself.
Right.
It's interesting. The reason I know that is because I'm teaching Zechariah, and there's this vision that Zechariah has of this woman who represents evil being put in a basket and brought over to Shinar, and a house being built for her there to worship. Anyway, it's just kind of an interesting thing where, and this is where all that's taking place. So.
Yeah. So, we see the idea, the mindset behind Belshazzar, that he's in this city, which he feels makes him untouchable, perhaps, and then he doesn't have the same respect and regard for the religious artifacts that Nebuchadnezzar had taken, and then just the actual atmosphere of the party there. It says in verse 4, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So not only were they not only were they using things that had been sacred for common use, they were going beyond and using them for idolatry. And it kind of reminds me of the Roman, and I can't remember who it was, but the Roman official that sacrificed pigs on an altar and just to totally desecrate the altar. Just using things, not just neutral and using them as common things, but actually aggressively against God and giving glory to these idols of gold and silver, iron and wood and stone. And so then in verse 5, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand, and the king saw the hand as it wrote. So he's having a good time, right? And all is well. And then he sees this vision, and it's a disembodied hand writing on the wall, and you just know nothing good is going to come from that. You're not going to just look up and have a disembodied hand writing on the wall and it turned out to be happy birthday. This is going to be something serious that he's going to have to deal with. And we can see how he responded. In verse 6, then the king's color changed and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way and his knees knocked together. And so this is one of the most humorous parts of this book, or really any book of the Bible, in my opinion, is it just shows the total vulnerability of mankind in the face of God. That he can think everything's fine 1 second, and then just a second later, he sees a message from God, and his color changed. I imagine he just went totally pale or drained of blood. And then his limbs gave way, or his thoughts alarmed him. So, he's just totally in shock and fear. His limbs gave way and his knees knocked together. When I think of this, I think of those, I was trying to find a little gif of this, but those animals, toys that we had when I was a kid, and they were pretty simple, so I think they've been around for a while. But they're put together with string and springs or something, and you push the bottom, and my favorite was always the giraffe because it was so long and lanky, and I think, might have had a second on that.
We have one at home.
Oh, I should have had, if I'd have known.
Well, we've all played with it.
Yeah. But you push the base of that thing and it just totally goes like a rag doll. And I can just imagine, I think we've all had some situation where we can identify with this, where something happens and it's just so shocking that we lose control in one way or another. Whether it's you're shocked by something and you just drop what you were holding, or you pass out, or you just fall over or have to lean against something. We've all had something like that happen, and we can get a small taste of what Belshazzar might have been feeling at that time. And then his knees knocking together, that's just comical. But it just shows how he's lost control. He whether he knows it or not, he's lost control. And so when we continue on, the king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers, and the king declared to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be third ruler in the kingdom." So he goes back to the tried and tested method of calling in the magicians and the wise men, and which really hasn't worked all that well in the past. But that's his go-to. That would be the standard operating procedure. So he calls them in and tries to get them to tell him what it means, and offers a great reward. And it's interesting here that at the end he says, "They shall be third ruler in the kingdom." And so I've looked into that a little bit, and it appears that Belshazzar's father may have still been the actual king of the empire at that time, but he didn't want to be restrained and stuck in Babylon. He wanted to do more of his building his nation in various areas. And some say that maybe he just he was disliked by the people, and so he didn't want to spend a lot of time in Babylon. But for whatever reason, it appears that he was still actually the king. But Belshazzar was the king in Babylon, and he had the authority. So he wouldn't be able to overrule his father, but he didn't have to go ask. He could make laws and so forth. And so he would be able to put someone in the next position. So that third spot, if you can tell me what this means, you can be third in the nation. And then the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to it the interpretation. And we'll just continue one more. The king, Belshazzar, was greatly alarmed, and his color changed. Again, I don't know what color he is now. But and his lords were perplexed. So they thought, oh, this will work. We'll be able to get an answer from these guys because they can figure these things out. But they couldn't do anything, and they didn't even pretend. I think it was the same kind of situation as in chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar brought them in to interpret his second dream, and he didn't have to threaten, or he didn't have to try to get them to tell him what the dream was. I don't think they were taking any chances at this point with some just made-up interpretations. I think they knew that was a dangerous game to play, and so they said, we don't know the answer. And so that would be very shocking for the wisest men of the city and of the nation to be totally dumbfounded by this message. Any comments or questions so far? All right. So, in verse 10, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, "O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers. Because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. But now let Daniel be called, and he will show you the interpretation." So the queen, and this appears not to be the queen as in Belshazzar's wife, because his wives and concubines were with him. So this appears to be like the queen mother, one or two generations removed. She was aware of these things that had happened before. and she had not forgotten like Belshazzar had. And when we look at it, just like in this last, in chapter 4, we read about Nebuchadnezzar having a dream, and then he calls in all the regular dream interpreters that had failed him the first time, even though Daniel had been successful, but he didn't call Daniel the first time. I think part of it is, maybe that was their primary job, or those kind of things. But there's a certain amount of forgetting and familiarity, I think. Familiarity breeds contempt is what they say. That, once you get used to having Daniel there, you kind of forget about the power that he represented. And I think, in my personal opinion, I think Daniel had kind of dropped, under the radar. I think that was much safer for him to go on and be faithful and try to influence the kings in whatever way he could, but not be out in front trying to make a name for himself, because that was the whole thing with the first dream, where he said, I don't want all the stuff that goes along with this. I'm doing this for your good. I'm doing this to relay God's message. If he was found to be right and they wanted to reward him, then that's fine. But he wasn't doing it for the money or the fame or the position. And so once some time had passed, I think he was fine to just take a back seat and let everybody else, do what they wanted to do, and then be there in case something happened. And it was going to happen. Right. So if I remember right, and we estimated Daniel probably was going to be around 20 when he went into captivity. Some think as young as 16 or maybe older, but I would guess 20, just since I'm the one talking, we're going to use. But if it was 20, and I believe 37 years after that, and plus another, I think 19 to this point. So 57, 60, 70, somewhere in the 70 range. He's old. He's not going to be one of the kids at this party, just like the Queen wasn't. This was a young people's event. And once they get in trouble, then they call in the older people, the wiser people. But he probably was, semi-retired at this point, I would think. Not having to go out and put himself out there, but yet still on hand and readily available for his interpretations and input. So they called, at least one person knew, here's the guy that we should call. And the description of, the Queen's description of Daniel is just really impressive. He said, in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. So, she's definitely a polytheist, but she recognizes it's beyond just human wisdom. And then in verse 12, an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, to interpret dreams, explain riddles, solve problems were found in Daniel. And so he's the guy to call if you've got a problem that needs to be solved. Bruce?
Great. I don't know, mystifies me a little bit. They say that Daniel has the spirit of the holy gods.
Right.
And, and that's a distinction that they choose to make in their description of Daniel. And it causes me to wonder, so what was the difference between what they called holy gods,
right,
plural, and just ordinary, plain, run-of-the-mill gods who didn't have this kind of insight and all of this stuff? It's a bizarre kind of construct in my mind.
Yeah, and I think it's just kind of, it just reminds me of the kind of hierarchy that we see everywhere in our world. They had gods for everything, and so, you wouldn't necessarily be seeking the wisdom of the god of rocks or, some lesser god, but the god of some intellectual kind of higher god. Those, I think, were in the upper echelon of gods. And they're like, he doesn't just have the insight of the god of rocks. He's got the insight of the holy gods.
You don't go to God.
Right. Mike?
Kind of throw it in the mix is these people, when they come up with their gods, they had human attributes.
Right.
They were liars, cheaters, backstabbers, adulterers, you name it.
Right.
Anything that man did, their gods did. So maybe that's the reference that they're making. It says he's not like, this God is not like our gods.
Not the bad gods.
They actually do righteous things. They make good judgments. They got some, good stuff going here. Not so much our gods.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if someone was a really good liar, they might have, somebody might have said, he's got the light of the god of lies. He is, if you need to, convince somebody of something, talk to that guy. And with all, as is a good thing. But here, Daniel has set himself apart from the others that serve those gods, and they know there's something different. And when I read this description of him, it's one of those things, again, as we read through Daniel, there's no negative character traits that we read about. And I don't think that's to say that Daniel was perfect or didn't have any, but I think we're given Daniel as a good example. And if we can achieve some of these character traits, that will help us in our walk in this life. And it won't just help us with our own problems, but it might help us to be called upon by non-believers who see what wisdom we get from the Bible. And so then we can help them with their problems, and then hopefully they will be led to Christ. So definitely a description that you want to be striving to match. Any other comments so far, Larry?
A sense of the timeline here. I mean, you can read through it and go, oh, this all happened right at the party. And yet it seems like it could be difficult for this to just be unfolding in 2 hours.
Real time.
You know what I'm saying?
I get the impression it's just one day event. Yeah. I don't know what time they started their drinking parties, so
Yeah.
I'm guessing probably earlier than most people would expect here. But
It's 5 o'clock somewhere.
yeah, and it's 5 o'clock in Babylon.
Well, yeah.
But I get the impression that this is kind of told in real time almost. There was some time that elapsed when they went to go get the items from the temple. There was some time that elapsed that the word spread throughout the palace area or wherever this was and got to the queen. There was a little bit of time that might have elapsed while they went and found Daniel. But it doesn't seem to me like this is spread out over more than just the day. Especially with the last ending of it. I'll give away the ending here. That and that very night, Belshazzar was killed. So it reads to me like it's all one day event. Any other comments or ideas on that? All right. So we're down to 13. So then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, who the king my father has brought from Judah." So let's start right there. You're that Daniel. That's kind of an odd way to introduce yourself to someone or to greet someone. But he doesn't say anything about the positive things. You're that Daniel, not the one that first started, he doesn't start off with that my father put in charge of everything and that, interpret his dreams and all the good stuff. and that you happen to be taken in captivity. No, he starts off almost like he's trying to make sure Daniel knows his place. You know, he's doing a little power check. You know, you're that Daniel who's a captive that my father took from Judah, and I think there's some animosity just in the fact that he was from Judah, because Pharaoh had already had to proclaim Nebuchadnezzar, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were saved, he had to proclaim that no one should speak against the Jews. And so that makes me think people were speaking against the Jews before that. And with as much time has passed and how quickly other things were forgotten, it makes me think that that animosity against the Jews had come back. And so there may be a jab just reminding him and everyone else that he's a Jew. And he says, I have heard that you have the spirit of the gods in you, and the light and understanding and excellence, wisdom are found in you. So he puts him in his place and says, okay, but I do need your help, so I'm going to be nice. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in here before me to read this writing and make it known to me its interpretation, but they could not show me the interpretation of this matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations, solve problems, and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed in purple, have a chain of gold around your neck, and be third ruler in the kingdom. So he still extends the same offer. I think it's one of those things that once the king says what's going to be the edict, then it stands. So even if he wanted to give Daniel a lesser reward, he wouldn't be able to. But then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. So he doesn't have that same hesitation that he had when he saw was going to give Nebuchadnezzar his bad news. He's not saying, oh, I don't want to have to tell you this. I wish this was for somebody else. No, he knows Belshazzar's heart, and he knows that this is the message that he needs, and he's not afraid to give it to him. And he says, this isn't about the money. And most likely giving him this message, in most cases, a lot of people would say at the end, I'm not going to give you the reward. I don't like that message. But he does. But Daniel's not going to let him off easy. Let's see. Possibly. It may have been a slap in the face, but it may have been a kind of tradition of what they did, like, oh no, I don't need to get paid for this. Okay, you can pay me, that. But I don't think Daniel would be doing that for that purpose, but I think others may have done that kind of as a societal norm, just to make themselves look better. Mike?
I get the impression that the relationship between these two is totally different than what it was with Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel seemed to have a respect for Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, a genuine respect for this individual. And this does not really, I mean, he does have a respect that he's the king.
Right.
And
The appropriate respect, yeah.
But it's like, no. You had your chance and you blew it. You knew the right things to do and you squandered everything. No, you're not getting another chance. This is it.
Yeah.
You made your head sleep in it.
And he kind of almost has the same feel, like he says, well, you did this for my father or grandfather or whatever, the king Nebuchadnezzar, now do this for me. And I almost feel like Daniel's got this feeling like, you, sir, are no Nebuchadnezzar. I'll do it, but not because of that. John?
Possibility also that when Daniel comes in, there's all sitting there with all the utensils from the temple.
Yeah.
And they're just totally blaspheming God and, things that they're using for common good. And I'm sure Daniel did not appreciate that, and he probably maybe just got so irked with them that he was just telling him the way he was.
Very, very blunt, yes. Yeah, and that's definitely, I think a part of it is that when Daniel is called, they've got all the temple things, and that's just a real slap in the face, not just a possible one, I think. Steve? Right.
To make the translation, which is not a good thing. And then also, when Daniel walked in, obviously in his interpretation, he knows what's going on. He knows that they were using these vessels to praise their idols, and he's like, and you don't praise God. But if Daniel is, 70, 80 years old, I imagine him thinking, I'm going to die soon anyway, I might as well, and being a little bit more grumpy and a little bit more confident because he has lived his life in a powerful position.
And
so now he goes and chews out the young guy, and if they kill him, they kill him,
And he's survived life and death situations, and done it and survived them because of his faithfulness. And so that definitely would give him that additional confidence. So we see, where did we get to? 17? Yeah, so he tells him he would be third ruler. And so 17, Daniel rejects the offer basically, but says that he will make it known to him. And so in 18 he says, O King, O King, the Most High God, and I just think it's interesting, real quick, to say, he doesn't say, O King, may you live forever, which everybody else had been doing, and I think Daniel had done with Nebuchadnezzar also. And so yeah, that's off to a rocky start, just right out of the gate. O King, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, and that heart being lifted up, I think is just that when his heart was filled with pride, that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew the Most High God rules in the kingdoms of men, or kingdoms in mankind, and sets over it whom he wills. So let's stop there. He gives him a little history lesson in case you forgot what happened to your grandfather, or in case you were too young to be around or know what was going on. But there should be no excuse, right? Because Nebuchadnezzar had recorded what had happened for history, and he wanted people to know what happened. And so Belshazzar should have known the history there. And so talks about his mind was made like that of a beast, and just there's a few things that, and you guys kind of covered it last week, but there's some other things that I heard and read that really, in my mind, this makes the most sense, is that God made Nebuchadnezzar think he was a beast of the field. And so he would be stuck like as a beast of the field in his mind and not be able to get out of it, knowing that I shouldn't be a beast of the field. I'm Nebuchadnezzar, but now I'm stuck in the body of an animal, and now I have to eat this grass because that's what this animal does. And it just totally there's some psychological terms for it, I think, lycanthropy, where you think you're an animal. And so I think that's what God miraculously did to him. And there was no way for him to get himself out of it by himself. And it was only when he understood, only when he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdoms of mankind and sets over it whom he will, was that lifted from him. And so that was his moment of accepting God's authority over him, and then God raised him back up from being humbled. Any ideas on that?
Well,
Yeah.
he
Yeah,
didn't
he-
need a conjurer, he needed a psychiatrist.
Right. Unfortunately,
But it
that
isn't-
wouldn't have
It
helped.
isn't what you would bring up if you're trying to win favors and make points and everything. But, you know, the
Yeah.
very lowest point of the greatest king on earth.
Yes. Interpret this vision. Well, remember when your grandpa acted like the beast, you know? Yeah, can we not talk about that? Can we move on? And it's kind of, that appears to be what happened in the Babylonian history, is that was pretty much, you know, cleaned out of the record. There's no record of Nebuchadnezzar going and having to live in the field as a beast. And so it's kind of like, you know, the victors write the history books, and you tend to clean things up to make people look better. And that I think is something that, you know, was happening here and happened with the Babylonian history. But Daniel's just putting it right out in front and center. And so that would have been a bad sign as well. Remember when Nebuchadnezzar was humbled lower than, you know, most anyone else had been humbled, and not been humbled in that way? Yeah, I don't want to hear much more of this if that's the direction you're going, right? So he said in 22, so Nebuchadnezzar was humbled until he gave God proper respect and authority. And in verse 22, and you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. But you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of the house that you have been of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. So he really says, I see what's going on here. And you have disrespected the one true God by trying to worship things that aren't even real and thinking they're the things that are going to protect you and preserve you. And the one true God whose breath is in your hand. You know, that sounds like a very threatening statement. You know, that your life itself is within God's hand. And that just implies to me that it's in total control. He can take it away, or he can let it remain. And so that God he has not honored. And in fact, he's greatly dishonored. So this sermon of Daniel's, we're going to hold there for a second. This sermon of Daniel's basically is, you already knew and saw from the example from your father or grandfather that the Most High God rules the kingdoms of mankind. And you saw that the proud would be humbled because he was greatly humbled. And third, you gave honor to idols that belonged to God. And so these are your trespasses. These are the reasons for this message that's on the wall that you're going to find out what the meaning is. Then from his presence the hand was sent. And so he's saying from God's presence, this hand was sent, and the writing was inscribed. And the writing was inscribed Mene, Tekel, Parsin, or Uparsin, depending on what version you have. And this is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Paris, or Parson, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So, they may have been able to figure out what these words were since they were in Aramaic. They may have been miraculously unable to read what the words actually were. But even knowing what the words were, they would not have known what the interpretation was without God's providing it to them. So if someone said, counted, weighed, divided, you wouldn't automatically think, oh, that is a terrible, that's a terrible fortune to have. No, I mean, it's just counted, weighed, divided. These are regular things that they would do, so it wouldn't necessarily speak to you of what the meaning was. But Daniel helps them out, and I think it's interesting that he says counted twice. Your days have been counted, and it's certain. There's no question. There's no, let me double check on this to make sure that I've counted correctly. The days have been numbered. Do you have a comment? Yeah, I mean, it's done and done. And there is no, he knows there's no change. That Belshazzar's beyond repentance, and perhaps even if he did repent, his days were still over. That he still may have to face that physical penalty. But I don't think Belshazzar did repent. I think that was understood that wasn't going to happen. And so his days were counted and then weighed. You've been weighed and found wanting. That's an interesting statement. I was trying to think of where I'd heard something like that before, but the only thing I can think of, sorry to use another Indiana Jones reference, was in the last crusade, the guy chooses a chalice that he thinks would be the one that Jesus blood would have been contained in, and it's just really gold, elaborate, shiny jewels and everything, and he drinks from it and meets his demise, and the guy says he chose poorly. You've been weighed and found wanting. That is just a terrible statement to me. And you can understand why Belshazzar's color had changed, the fear that had been struck into his heart. Do you think he knew that he was already going to be found wanting? Do you think he'd understood that if he was weighed and measured, that he would come up short? I think he probably did. I think when we live a certain way, and it's not the way that God wants us to live, we know when we violate our conscience, even if before we were Christians and we did things we knew we shouldn't. It's not that we knew that we violated God's word. We just knew that we were doing something we shouldn't. We were doing some wrong, and that we weren't living up to the standard that we had for ourselves. Mark?
He didn't already know, in the sense that God is very patient, and like his grandfather gave him plenty of warning of what was going to happen. And so it strikes me as odd if he felt like this was the first time anything was wrong.
Yeah, if this was his first notice of that he had violated something. No, I said it before, I think in the first class, God's not the God of surprises. He's not just waiting to pounce on Belshazzar. He knows this is his character, this is how he's been living, and if God allowed him to go on, that this is how he would choose to continue living. And so he would have known, he would have had some sort of idea that he wasn't living up to what he was supposed to. Steve, do you have something? John?
Well, if he knew it about what God through Daniel had prophesied about the end of the Babylonian kingdom, the statue, and at this very time, as we were speaking, your kingdom is through, and the Medes and Persians are going to be the next in line to take over this kingdom and many others.
Right. He may not have been aware of the first dream, but I would think he probably would have been, because that's kind of the royal history would be passed down from generation to generation. And Daniel knew that he knew about the second dream and his subsequent humbling and restoration. So I think it's very likely that he would have been aware of the statue, but yeah, he probably didn't think, oh, today's the day we're going to go from gold to silver. He didn't wake up with that. Right. So Belshazzar's response, I think it's tough to read what Belshazzar's thinking in this one, because in verse 29, then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed. So Daniel didn't say necessarily that it was going to happen that night. So maybe Belshazzar thought he had more time. Maybe it was just a symbolic gesture that, oh, congratulations on being third ruler of a defunct empire. A third share of nothing. And maybe that was Belshazzar indicating that he didn't believe that really would happen. Or that, maybe that might happen, but it's not going to happen right now. And we've got time. You can still enjoy this purple garment and gold chain and be third in charge, as long as, if this actually does happen, then you can have it until that time. We don't know for sure, but that just, based on his character, it seems to me like it's a denial almost of what Daniel is saying. Bruce?
Knew the concept of repentance. I mean, he knew the record from from Nebuchadnezzar, and I think he would have been aware of how Nebuchadnezzar was restored and what he had to do previous to that, and repent. So I don't know that he was totally ignorant of that, that responsibility he had before God.
Yeah, and I think based on the fact that Daniel had reviewed it and told him, you knew that what this happened, and just in the very, this chapter wasn't written right before the events happened, but to see what Nebuchadnezzar had done by proclaiming that this was the Most High God, and that even further back, that the God of the Jews should not be spoken against. He knew what making things right looked like, and he chose not to do that. And so, what does that mean for us? What do we gain from this bad example? You don't know. First of all, our days are numbered. We don't know when we're going to die and face judgment. So we need to get in a right relationship with God, remove anything that's getting in the way of that, and consider our own measurement, our own weight. Are we falling short of what God sees what we should be? And of course, we're not going to earn our salvation, but the faith that goes with what we do and our works, then that gives us the grace of God that meets that weight. We can't do it ourselves, but we can meet the weight that God's looking for in us because of God's grace and the grace of Jesus. And then divided. And we didn't talk much about divided. It could also have meant torn, but even less aggressive word of divided, just meaning your kingdom is going to be separated. We don't have our own kingdoms, but we will be divided from God for eternity if we fail to respond properly to the gospel. And so we see Belshazzar's demise. He was killed that very night. God had determined that he knew Belshazzar's heart, and it was time that he had met the fullness of his sin, and so he was destroyed. It's just real quickly, and it says in verse 31, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. And that really seems like it should be verse 1 of chapter 6. But Belshazzar the city was conquered just that night. And there's various tellings of how exactly it might have happened. But one of the main ones is that there was the river that was coming, I believe it was Euphrates, that was coming into the city. And the Syrians army, or not, the Persian army, thank you. Medo-Persian army had dammed up the river at some point and diverted it so that as that river would come into the city, it usually would, there would be no entrance there, but it had gotten low enough where the armies could just march right in on semi-dry ground and be able to take the city without really any kind of battle. Steve?
The God in whose hand holds your life, and then that night he dies. So
Right.
that is a pretty good exclamation at the end of the sermon, right? It's, everyone else who heard that, wow, I
Right.
gotta listen to that guy. And the other thing is Babylon is actually a salt flat now, because when they diverted the river, that river just went on land and dried up, and the minerals build up over time and actually poison the ground into nothing grows there, and it's a salt waste now, kind of salty swamp.
Interesting.
Area. Yeah.
But yeah, that sermon at the end was not necessarily, that message was for Belshazzar, but it was also for everyone else that was in that room. So they would know when this happens, it was God who did it. It wasn't just a coincidence that he died that night, but this was the hand of God putting an end to his life. Any other comments or questions before we close? So that was just another drawing of the wall that made them feel so safe and impenetrable, but yet it did nothing when God was ready to send someone to bring judgment. Steve? Yeah.
It's considered like unconquerable. And
Right.
the prophets actually foretold it would fall in a night. I don't remember which one, Ezekiel or Isaiah or something.
Yeah, it was something that, you wouldn't believe it if it hadn't really happened. And you know that it wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the hand of God saying, okay, now their time is done. And really reinforcing that message that God rules in the kingdoms of men. All right, let's close with a word of prayer.